Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Vanoli, Vice President of Marketing at Assure. Today, we're talking about a really important topic around overtime. So overtime first became a thing. I think it's going back to 1928 with the Fair Labor Standards Act. But the rules around the thresholds where that must kick in have changed, right? As times have changed and hours worked and pay rates, et cetera. And so there's another change that's imminent. And so really, really important that employers get ahead of this, because you need to start thinking about how to schedule for it, how to budget for it, how to plan for it. So my guest today to unpack this topic, if you're a regular listener to the show, you'll know Mary Simmons. Mary is our Vice President of HR Consulting at Assure. For the last 8 years, she's been an adjunct professor at the New York Institute of Technology. Prior to that, Mary is the Director of HR Consulting for a 55-year-old HR consulting law firm in New York. So among many other jobs, welcome, Mary. Look forward to our discussion today.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here.
So do I have FLSA 1928 right? And that's the origin of overtime as a law?
It is, absolutely. And so there's a little bit more to it, right? So what we're talking about today, when we talk about the overtime rule, it's not only who is eligible for overtime, right? So that's the difference between exempt and non-exempt employees. Right. But I also just wanted to give a little clarity on when they're eligible for overtime. So when you talk about who is eligible, the individuals who are eligible for overtime are non-exempt employees. So your exempt employees who are paid salary are not eligible for overtime. And this gets a lot of employers into trouble, right? Because designating somebody exempt versus non-exempt, a lot of times employers will go, oh, Mike wants to be paid a salary, so we're going to make him exempt. And there's so much more to it. And we on another webinar had discussed and gotten into a little bit more detail on this. But for our purposes today, employers need to remember that there's a primary duties test that will determine whether or not an employee is exempt. So that's one of the things that they have to consider. And what that primary duties test does is says that 50% of that employee's time should be devoted to responsibilities that are in step with one of the 3 white-collar exemptions. And there are other exemptions from overtime, but today we're really going to focus on those 3 white-collar exemptions. So that's the executive exemption, meaning that you direct 2 or more employees for the majority of your day, right? So 50% of the time is the standard for the Fair Labor Standards Act. And then, of course, for California, when they're talking duties, primary duties test, they're going to say 51% of your time. And this is important because when we talk about the executive exemption, that and the administrative one that we're going to talk about next are really overused by employers, right? And I'll give you a great example. Walmart stores had a big lawsuit because their managers that are out on the floor helping customers, stocking shelves, but also managing 2 or more people were exempt employees. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. It's a retail store. They work a lot of overtime, and they were not receiving overtime because they were classified as exempt. But when the courts started looking at it, they said they're not supervising these employees 50% of their time. They're supervising the employees about 10% of the time. They're maybe saying, hey, Mike, stock that shelf better. Or they're saying, here's the schedule for the week. But the rest of the time, they were essentially doing the same duties as the other employees. So that executive exemption, you really need to be careful. The Fair Labor Standards Act has a very long paper, 2-3 pages long on other factors that come into effect to have that executive exemption. And, employers really, I always say this, you can't contract around the law, right? You can't bend the law so that it fits your organization. You really need to stay in keeping with this. And I know I've said this before, Mike, but it bears repeating. Wage and hour lawsuits outtrend discrimination lawsuits at least 2 to 1. They are easy to prove. It's black and white, whether you paid me correctly or not. And a lot of other factors get into it. And I think some of the other reasons, when we're helping an employer that happens to get, a Department of Labor audit and they're looking at their pay practices, a lot of times it's straight up ignorance, right? These laws are difficult to understand. I think employers, again, we always say they don't know what they don't know. I mean, how would you know that, if somebody told you the executive exemption means somebody, manages 2 or more people, you'd make all your managers exempt. And that's simply, not the way that we can do it. So the
Mary,
yeah.
Can I that's a question for sort of cut in on you.
Yeah.
So for smaller employers, growing companies, a lot of laws, there's an employee threshold, Affordable Care Act, more than 50 employees, COBRA, 20 employees, et cetera. Is there an employee cutoff for Fair Labor Standards Act threshold, the executive exemption for overtime? This is for everybody, right?
This is for everybody. And that's, I think, what also gets, some employers into trouble. They think they're, I'm too small. I only have 5 employees. I'm going to make one person exempt. I mean, I have to tell you, when we do HR assessments, which is one of the things we like to do with new employers, right? We like to take the temperature of their HR policies and procedures and get them into compliance. I can't tell you how many employers don't classify their employees exempt versus non-exempt. How many of them say, oh, everybody's salary here. They all want to know what they're making for the week. So we pay them all salary, right? Which is another error if you have non-exempt employees in the mix, right? So again,
and I want to nail that down because your Walmart example was perfect because that's real life. But
of course.
As a small business person, we shouldn't be thinking, oh, that's Walmart, that doesn't apply to me. If I'm a retailer and I'm the owner and I'm a on the floor manager, but maybe I have 2 locations, so I split time between the 2. And so in each store I have a store manager, but that store manager is also spending 80% of their time at the register, stocking shelves, and they're directing people maybe in the daily stand-up, or dare I say, anything less than 50% of their time directing those other 2 employees. It doesn't matter that you're not Walmart. The law still applies to you, even though you've only got 2 employees or 5 employees.
Correct. I mean, I have a bagel store that I support. He's got 10 employees, right? And it's okay to have that executive exemption and still ring the register and still put the bagels in the bag and give them to the clients. That's okay. You can do some non-exempt responsibilities, but it's the primary duties need to be directing others. And then the next exemption, I think, really confuses people. And I think it's partly because of the title, which is the administrative exemption. And I'll give you the best example here is the office manager, right? So there are some positions where I could say to you, and I try never to say always or never in human resources, but there are some positions that I could say to you are almost always exempt. Outside sales, almost always exempt. Inside sales, almost always non-exempt, right? And you hear me saying almost, right? But when you come to the administrative exemption, I think of a lot of employers go, oh, my office manager has she's doing administrative, or he's doing administrative responsibilities, or they're doing, ordering supplies and et cetera, and they're exempt. And what I'll tell you is that is one of the positions that I would never say always or never for the exemptions, because it looks so different for each employer. And that's why job descriptions are so important, because my office manager is going to do something different than the bagel store's office manager, than Walmart's office manager, right? They're all doing something a little bit different, and they, to meet the exemption, have to exercise discretion and independent judgment of matters of importance for the organization. So I had an employer say to me, well, they order office supplies, Mary. That's really important. And I said, I understand that that's important. That's not going to meet the duties test. Okay. That's not significant to the running of the organization. So administrative exemption, think human resource manager, think your controller. So those are the types of positions that are going to have that administrative exemption. So then we move on to the professional exemption.
And Mary, can I ask a clarifying question on that? So your example, if they simply ordered the office supplies, that's not doesn't meet the test. If they were the ones deciding which office supplies, which brands, what sizes, quantities, which ones to use, not use, how they would be used, that would that kind of cross the threshold for discretion and independent judgment?
I would think more, bigger picture, like they choose the vendors that the organization uses and negotiates, right? Independent judgment.
Yes.
It negotiates the contracts with those vendors. So that's the way I would want an employer to look at it. And again, no contracting around the law. If they're really not doing that, then they should be non-exempt. Does that make sense?
Right. So if you as an owner have negotiated a deal with Staples to order all your supplies, your office manager ordering those supplies from Staples, it doesn't pass the administrative test, the duties test. But if you said, hey, office manager, your job is to make sure everyone is supplied with everything they need, and they are the ones who go find the Staples, compare against other vendors, local providers, negotiate the contract, and they independently decide on the quantities, frequencies, prices, that is kind of the contrast that we're talking about, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
As an example, and obviously everybody has a lot more responsibilities, but yes, that does give clarity to it. And then we move to the professional exemption. Again, this can trick up employers also, and this is where your employee has an advanced knowledge through education, right? So we support a pharmaceutical organization, and their chemists must have a PhD in chemistry to meet the requirements of the position, to actually function in the position. And so where some of the employers that we support get tripped up here is they'll say, well, Mike is in marketing and he has his master's in human resources. So I'm going to give him the professional exemption because he's got advanced knowledge. No. That advanced knowledge has to be specific to the position that they're functioning in. So just because you have a PhD in philosophy, right? If that is not something that is on the job description that is necessary for the position that you are actually functioning in, then that is not going to meet the professional exemption, right? And those are your three white collar exemptions: the executive, the administrative, and the professional exemption. So that overtime rule says you need to decide exempt. You are not eligible for overtime based on you meeting one of these three exemptions. And again, there are other exemptions, but we're going to focus on these today. And the other thing that they have to meet is the pay threshold. So
Hey, can I stop you on before we go to pay threshold? Because I think this is the most black and white area. On the professional one, so if I own a construction company, a small construction company, and I just hired someone and they've got their degree in civil engineering, but they spend the majority of their time on a backhoe or a skid steer or swinging a hammer doing the work themselves. That's what we're talking about here, right? Operating the skid steer does not require a civil engineering degree. So if they're spending most of their time doing that work, despite the fact that they're highly educated and might do some civil engineering work, that would not pass the threshold. Is that correct?
I don't love that example, and I'm going to tell you why.
Yeah,
because he has the advanced degree in a position that he's functioning in. So civil engineering is going to help him do his job. So if it was on the job description and or the ad, and what I encourage employers to say is civil engineering, masters in civil engineering. We're not, when we talk advanced knowledge through education, we're really not usually talking not just, I don't mean to minimize a college degree, but a college degree. We're talking masters, we're talking engineering certification, we're talking CPA, right? That's really what we're talking about.
Yeah. You know what I did, Mary? I commingled concepts from the duties test, right? I was commingling the 50% rule with the professional rule, right? And really all you have to do is pass one of the three, not a combination of them, correct?
Correct. Well, no, you should try to, so professional is different, right? Each of them have, a 2-page summary from the Department of Labor that tells you when you meet these exemptions. So yes, you muddled it a little bit for me. And
I'm guessing the entrepreneurs out there are thinking the same things, and it's muddled for them too. So I'm glad I muddled it, so you could.
Yeah. But so your example may be correct, but I think it's better to give that black and white. I have a philosophy degree and I'm doing engineering, right? So, and did the employer put this as a preferred or a mandated degree on the job description? That's how we have to back into it, because it really is employer specific.
Yeah.
Right.
And just so I'm clear, and more importantly, our audience is clear, of the 3 duties tests, executive, administrative, and professional, I only have to pass one of those tests, correct?
No. The exemptions are executive, administrative, and professional. The duties test has to be passed for all 3 of them for the individual to have that exemption. And in addition to passing that duties test, the incumbent, the employee, must also pass the pay threshold, which is the next thing that we were going to talk about.
I'm really glad that I screwed that up, because I think that there's a lot of seriously. So there's the duties test.
It's very confusing. That's why, our clients are like, oh, thank you, Mary, because it's very, very, very confusing.
So I want to keep reading until you tell me it's right, to make sure everybody listening is on the same page. So there's the primary duties test, which is the 50%, 51 in California, but then there are 3 exemptions: the executive, administrative, and professional, that would be exemptions from that duties test, right?
There are 3 white collar exemptions. And to be applicable, those exemptions, the employee must pass, number 1, the duties test, and number 2, the pay threshold.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. I think I've got it. Hopefully everyone else listening has it now. Let's move on to pay threshold, which I think is a lot more black and white.
Yeah, it is. And so what also has to be in place is that individual, so let's say we've decided Mike has the executive exemption, right? And truth be told, Mike, you would pass the executive exemption because you direct 2 or more employees, and you would also pass the administrative exemption. Okay. And, you know, so let's just say that Mike is the director of marketing. He passes the executive exemption. Now, I also have to make sure that I am paying Mike the pay threshold. So what employers need to think about, super easy. Everybody knows there's a minimum wage for your hourly non-exempt employees, right? Your employees always get the better of the law. What's higher, your state minimum wage or the federal minimum wage? Federal minimum wage is still at $7.15 an hour. So most states, not all, most states are higher. Well, the same is in effect for your exempt employees. They must also be paid the minimum salary, either designated by the federal government, or if your state is higher, then you need to meet that threshold. So right now, the federal salary minimum for exempt employees is $684 a week, and that increased back in 2020, January of 2020. So annually, that comes out to about $35,568. So that's what we're talking about today, is that that pay threshold, which yes, went up in 2020, but before 2020, Mike, it hadn't moved in, I think, 10 or 15 years, right? Yeah. So what the mistake that the federal government made, if I can be so bold, is it should have been incrementally being increased, right? To keep up with the incremental increases in minimum wage on the federal side. But for some reason, it didn't. So that's what we're talking about today, is that pay threshold for your exempt employees for the white collar exemptions is due to increase again. That's what we're talking about. Now, there's nothing imminent, you know, it was supposed to be done in April. Here we are in May, hasn't been done. You know, so if I was a betting lady, and I'm really not, but I'd say it's going to go through this year. But we want to talk about it with our employers because you need to prepare for things like this.
I'm thinking maybe you and I have a conversation another day. It's going through my head is the floor for exempt or non-exempt has continued to rise, aka the minimum wage, but the floor for exempt has not. That creates there's not as much pay disparity between exempt and non-exempt, which creates a whole host of other, I'd say, cultural problems in our society. That's probably a super interesting topic to talk about another day. But let's move on to more detail about what you're talking about here, about what's changing specifically around the pay threshold.
Right. So one of the important things that you were, you know, sort of leading to is it creates pay compression, right? So what's happening is my manager might make 35 and change, right? The organization says, all right, so the minimum, I'm in a state that doesn't have a higher minimum than the federal government. So I'm going to give them the minimum that I can, and I'm going to have them work 60 hours a week because they truly are exempt. I know I can get away with it. I'm going to pay them 35 and change a year. Well, if the minimum wage in my state did go up, right? And you've got California and New York at $15 an hour, and Washington in some areas over $15 an hour. Well, $15 an hour roughly comes out to about 30,000. So now, you know, I'm inching up on my manager. I'm at 30,000 and my manager's only making 35 and change. That's pretty close. And add to that, Mike, that if I'm working in a organization where I'm that non-exempt person making $15 an hour and I can get overtime, now I'm getting time and a half and I'm working 10 hours of overtime a week, now I'm going to make more than my manager. Those are the issues that I need employers to look at, and look at not just now because we're trying to prompt you that these changes may happen, but I also need you to look at this every single year, because something else that we need to consider when we're talking salaries is pay equity, right? So that's another issue. Maybe we'll have another webinar on that, but there's a lot of rules, Mike, around pay equity, a lot of laws around pay equity. That could be a discrimination claim. So we have to make sure that when we have these pay compression issues, that you don't have a knee-jerk reaction, that you talk to professionals like us, that we help you do salary benchmarking to say, all right, clearly minimum wage went up, the hourly rate went up, but the salary didn't, right? So I do need to give raises to my managers. What's the right number, right? You cannot do that arbitrarily, and you also can't provide those to your managers arbitrarily, right? You're not going to give all your white males a 10% increase, and the females or the people of color, the supervisors of color, nothing, right? And that might seem, I'm making a gross exaggerated example, but it happens all the time. So this is what I need our employers to start thinking about, right? So Assure Payroll, most of our listeners are utilizing. You can do a pay report, right? It's got the person's name and the position. Look at all of those salaries and start making some decisions, right? About how you're going to make some of these changes. And we have a lot of decisions to make here, right?
And I'm gonna pause because I want to try to bring this as viscerally real as possible. So easy to understand in some hypothetical big company scenario, right? But the employer who's listening today that says, well, I'm not a racist, I'm not a bigot, I would never do that. But if you're a small employer, let's say you've got 20 employees divided up against 2 teams with 2 supervisors. One who's been with you for 10 years, it's your trusted right hand, coincidentally is a white male, and you've got another excellent manager but less experienced, hasn't produced the results yet, maybe coincidentally is female or a person of color, and you make some decision based on my trusted right hand, been with me for a long time, they deserve more, but they actually perform the same duties, the same job. This is where small employers, especially without HR expertise, just crush themselves because it's illegal, right? And because you're not basing it on pay equity based on the job description, and you might have it might be unintended, it might have been malicious discrimination, but the fact is you're paying differently. The outcome is the same. Am I thinking about that right?
Except for one caveat, you are, but there's one caveat to the example that you gave. So when we make employment decisions, we always base them on business needs, all the way from how I write an ad, to how I interview, to how I give pay increases. And the one thing that you said in that example was that person that was the right hand had over 10 years experience.
Yeah.
So it sounded like the other individual had less experience, right? So I am using factual information in that example to give that individual an increase. Don't forget that Title VII says you cannot make those employment decisions, negative or positive, based on the protected categories, right? Color, creed, sex, age, etc. You can make those decisions based on experience, based on performance, right? That's where I want my employers to focus. And so if you're saying to me that that individual, let's call him Joe has 10 years experience and Sally has 3 years experience, Joe should earn more because there is a business reason. We have factual evidence of why Joe should be paid more. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm going to say, and this is going to sound stupid because somebody used the word but, and you're the expert, not me. I think employers need to think about, there's the law and what you state to stay compliant. There's also, you can be sued for anything, right? I personally know an employer who, small employer, less than 10 employees, and salesperson / sales manager, the title was the same, left. They were more experienced. Someone else who was an existing sales rep got put into the job as the sales leader, happened to be a female, and she was paid less than the person leaving, clearly demonstrably less years of experience. It didn't stop the fact that there was a retaliation. It was a lawsuit for equal pay, and then ended up being in a retaliation suit that cost this company, even though they won, tens of thousands of dollars to defend. So I guess probably where my brain is at is, you're 100% right. You're the expert, not me, on the law. But as an employer, you have to be thinking about the optics of situations in addition to that. Is that fair? Is there any other correction or guidance you'd give me?
No, I mean, I want employers to be aware of this. I want employers to understand all of the laws that we try to teach them. But what I also say to employers is, if you're using good business reasons and factual information, one person has a higher degree, one person has 10 years experience, the other has 3, then you can defend yourself in a court of law, right? And the other thing when you talk about optics is definitely culturally, we have to think about, how does the culture, look here, right? Because we cannot tell our employees that they are not allowed to talk about their pay. That right. is, protected, concerted activity. That's a condition of work. So our employees are allowed to talk about their pay, right? I'm allowed to say, Mike, how much money do you make? You don't have to answer me. So they know what each other makes, right? For the most part. So yes, you always have to be concerned about those things, but we also have to operate a business to the best of our abilities, right? And to do so, you do have to rely on some of those facts. You can never, and I will never tell an employer that even if you do everything right, can you protect yourself from a lawsuit? No,
right.
That's impossible. I mean, people get sued in the grocery store because somebody bumped into them with their grocery cart, right? So it's a litigious society. You can't protect yourself against that. But what we try to do is help our employers so that if that came and that to fruition, that they could be defendable in a court of law because they did everything right.
Yeah, that's really good advice, Mary.
So you need to be aware, but I also, always tell employers, your hands should not be tied to operate your business. You can't look at laws that way, right? You can't. When we did sexual harassment last week, and I usually do that training and say, I don't want anybody walking out of here and saying, I can never tell a joke ever again, right? That's not the message when we talk about these laws. But you are correct. I want everybody to be aware. So let's just talk more about, the laws are changing, right?
Yeah.
And the reason is, because, the Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh is saying, this overtime pay is definitely too low. And I would agree with that. And I think, most of the employers on the call will agree with that, but I also want to carve out a caveat here that state overtime rules may differ. So let's just take a sidestep. We talked about federal. Let's take a sidestep and talk about some of the exemptions for our, other states. And believe it or not, Alaska is in the list here, where they have different overtime rules. I'm sure you can guess California and New York are in there, absolutely. And so they have come out and said, California threshold for the white collar exemptions, and they do have, thresholds for the size of the employer, right? So if in California an employer has 26 or more employees, then those white collar exemptions, the minimum is 58,240 annually, right? Look at the difference, Mike. Federal is 35 and change. California is 58 and change. If you have fewer than 25 employees, then it's 54, still substantially higher than that federal minimum. And that's because they haven't raised it. I mean, they raised it in 2020, but before that, they didn't raise it for 15 years. It is too low. I would agree based on that. New York is very similar. New York differentiates it by the area, right? Because, we have New York City. So New York City is a little bit different than Long Island. New York City is 58,000. Long Island, Westchester is a little bit lower at 54 and change. And then upstate is even lower, which is 48, almost 49. So again, this is a lot for employers to keep up with. We support clients all over the nation, so it definitely keeps us on our toes. It's something that we are very focused on. We know that these lawsuits are huge. And again, this is also a cultural thing. We need to pay people compliantly. We need to pay them, what the state and federal government is mandating that we pay them. And again, in some of these, states like New York, it's not all 3 white collar exemptions. It's just the executive and the administrative exemption that has the higher thresholds. So it gets very confusing to say the least, right?
Yeah, and I'm just thinking the math that you have to go through as an employer. There's you said it perfectly that you still have to run a business, right? And so I think most employers want to pay their people as much as they reasonably can to attract and retain the great talent, right? There's also so much margin in a business. Some business models have a lot of profit margin. Some operate on razor thin margins, and the money just doesn't exist to pay. So if you were the delta between the federal rate of, call it 35-ish versus a California mid 50s, upper 50s, the businesses simply couldn't afford to pay, and you would have to go to an non-exempt status for employees to and convert them to hourly. But then you better not be making them work more than 40 hours a week, otherwise you're going to break the bank in overtime too. This is really complex for an employer, isn't it?
It's really complex, and I will add, state the obvious, that we're in an inflationary period. So yes, your employees are asking for higher salaries. I mean, I've never seen salaries like this, entry level, et cetera.
Right.
And to sort of help with that, California now also added an inflationary rider so that salary, goes up with inflation, which isn't going to last forever, but yes, this is challenging for employers. There's just no question. And so, if we start to talk about what should employers do next, what you were talking about is an option, right? So let's just say that for those businesses listening to us today, you're not in New York and California, right? But you're saying, maybe the federal government is going to get close to these numbers. Do I think they're going to jump this high? No, because you also need to realize that those New York thresholds went up incrementally within a 4-year period. And the federal government may do something similar. But I can tell you, Mike, those increases over those 4 years were not our usual 3% increases that most organizations give employees. It was higher than that. So when we work with employers, you know, we'll sit down and we'll say, okay, who do you have that's exempt, right? This is what they're making now. Let's just call it 40,000. And let's just say that the federal government wants it to go to 50, right? So obviously that's more than a 10% increase. Very few employers can afford that, you know, depending on how many managers you have, you know, that could be, you know, staggering. So yes, your option is to keep them exempt and raise the salary, and you have to raise it when they say to raise it. If it is effective January of 2023, Mike, that increase goes in then. You can't say, I'm going to give it to them slowly. No, you cannot contract around the law. So that's option A, right? So let's talk about option A, which is, again, how, you know, compression, right? So, you know, you may have the senior manager making 60,000, and now the federal minimum goes up to 58,000, like it is in New York City. Now there's only a $2,000 difference, so you still have pay compression, right, at these salary levels when this increase goes up.
Right.
Right. And so there's a lot of factors. Can the business afford it? What is the pay compression that this is going to cause? In other words, am I going to have to give that mid-level manager the increase mandated by the federal government and give their manager an increase so that they're not making the same salary, which has happened at some of my employers? And let's talk about option B, which you mentioned. Oh, the employer says, I really can't afford that. I'm going to switch this employee to non-exempt. So just a little word here. When we talk about Fair Labor Standards Act, it is very rare, if ever, that you can't make somebody that may be exempt non-exempt, right? The federal government wants you to pay overtime. They want you to pay overtime to people who are due overtime. And that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Right. So, and, you know, don't forget, when somebody's exempt, there is other benefits that go with being exempt. You get paid a salary, Mike. So if you have to run out an hour early, we should not be deducting anything less than full days from you. So if you run out at 4 o'clock instead of working your 9 to 5 and you're exempt, you should still be paid your salary. Okay. So there are some benefits to being exempt, obviously. So if we go with option B and we make Mike the director of marketing non-exempt, what do you think Mike's going to think? What issues do you think I'm going to have?
As you're saying this, I'm just having all these thoughts in my head. It's like when I entered the workforce, you know, some almost 30 years ago, I feel like there was definitely a level of prestige around being salary versus hourly that has slowly evaporated over a many-year period. But there's still a connotation in my head that I'm getting a demotion, right?
Yes. Yes. It's a cultural thing, Mike. Number one, people like to get paid salary, right? Because I know I'm going to make $500 a week, right? There's a security there. Number two, now Mike has to sign in. You have to sign in your hours. Now, if I had my druthers, everybody would be signing in for hours, but I'm going to get off my soapbox. Non-exempt get paid for every hour they work. They must sign in through a SHRM payroll system, right? We have all easy ways for employees to do it, but Mike never did that before. And now Mike has to sign a timesheet. If he forgets to do it,
25 years since I had to fill out a time card, right? And
that's right.
now you're gonna make me do it again? What? Right.
That's right. So now we're talking possible job dissatisfaction, disengagement by that population that we said, oh, you used to be exempt, now we're going to make you non-exempt. Oh, and by the way, no overtime. Right? So there is so much. First of all, anytime we talk about changes for our employees, communication is key. 100% key. When I have guided employers through this, I have said, you need to be transparent. You need to say, the Fair Labor Standards Act changed some regulations, and to meet those regulations, we're changing you to non-exempt. Whatever, I'm being a little flip, a very positive, clear communication needs to be given to these employees. You need to sit down ahead of time and explain to them why and how this change is happening, that it is no reflection on them, that is a change in the laws, right? And expect that your employees know more than you know, right? Because they're going to look up the law and say, oh, instead of raising me to 58,000, you made me non-exempt.
Right.
You have to weigh these factors. It will be a hit on your culture if it is done incorrectly. But
yeah, because
those are your options.
I didn't think about the other side of that coin. It's like, okay, maybe I'm not offended that I now have to sign in, sign out, but it's going to look real obvious that the reason you did this is to not have to pay me for what I now start to believe that I'm worth, right?
That's right. That's right. So employers need to start thinking about this, right? If you have exempt employees at that federal threshold, that 35 and change, I want you to think about incrementally increasing them. And, also, you may want to start having them sign in and say, just how many overtime hours are they working? If they're not working any overtime hours, then making them non-exempt is not, yes, there may be a cultural employee relations issue there, but it won't cost you more money, right? If your executives are working, your exempt employees are working 60 hours of overtime, right? Making them non-exempt is probably going to cost you more money, or maybe net the same as raising their salary to whatever the federal government decides to raise it to.
Right.
So for my money, I would look at who is on that threshold, who's close to that, that 35 and change. The next thing I would do is those people that are close to it, I would start having them sign in, and you can communicate that in a positive way. Hey, Mike, at the end of the week, just tell me how many hours you did, right? If you don't want to make them go into, their Assure payroll and actually sign in, which would be my preferred way to do it, so that you can start doing a cost analysis on what this is going to actually cost your organization. Because like I said, changing them to non-exempt and for them to get overtime may end up costing you more than increasing the salary.
So Mary, if I'm listening today, I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm thinking, okay, this isn't great news for me, but I understand it. This is super helpful news, and I will plan for it. They're probably screaming at their computer screen or their phone saying, well, how much is it going to go up? And I know you can't predict that. We're above our pay grade, but maybe can you set any expectations for how much you think this is likely to go up?
Well, you have two states, California and New York, that are substantially higher than the federal minimum wage, right? Substantially. They're $20,000 and change more, right? Yeah. So, I would say it's, if they were to do it the way that makes sense and the way that New York did it, is it would go up a little bit in the next 4 years, right? But I would predict at least a 5% increase over that 35 and change, at least, and it may be more. But
Yeah.
but you know, is it going to be incremental, 5% a year or 2% a year? I don't know, but it'll definitely be more, and I think it'll be more than 3%.
It would seem to me that like a lot of contracts will tie pricing to a consumer price index kind of a thing. I'm wondering that it seems to me that the thing that got most out of step is that minimum wage increased, there wasn't the corresponding exempt overtime wage increase, and that's really where this thing got out of step. Do you think that those two things will get married back up, or is that's just too wonky and too hard of a political question to answer?
And you know, I don't know where they're going to go, to be honest with you. But you know, minimum, the hourly rate is $7.15, and the salary is 35.5. There is still disparity, right? So in my mind, minimum wage should be going up as well. I haven't heard anything about that, but in my mind, that only makes sense for minimum wage to go up as well. Now, you know, when the legislators started talking about this, we weren't in such a high inflationary period. And now, of course, you have a lot of analysts, financial analysts, et cetera, Wall Street talking about, you know, a recession is imminent. And we know this, right? History will show inflationary, recessionary, right, that they follow each other. So that might change things, right?
Right.
So
Right.
as it should, and in my mind, I think that may be what delayed things, is inflation just keep rising, right? And then saying, well, we were going to increase it, you know, this amount, maybe it should be this amount. Uh-oh, now there's going to be a recession. So I think there's so many factors, and they're, you know, really trying to do the right thing by employers, by employees, et cetera. I don't know what I'd do if I was in charge. So you know, I can't really guess what they would do, but it will go up. That's what employers need to focus on. They need to do a salary evaluation. They need to work with professionals. They need to look at who's at risk, how you're going to do it, and what the cost analysis of doing that will be.
So I think to kind of put a bow on this conversation today, you know, we're not advocating for, against. We're just trying to bring the best information we can to growing companies, to entrepreneurs, about certainly what the law says, what we think the law changes will be to help you see around corners, but also have a finger on the pulse culturally what's going on. I mean, we have these legal changes. It's also super interesting to see you know, such small increases of minimum wage on the federal side. You know, increasingly states and local municipalities, you know, there's a lot of $15 an hour minimum wage municipalities now, right? That local governments, and then certainly just the marketplace itself, the supply and demand of labor, when there's a labor shortage, demand for labor is high, and wages inevitably go up, especially in an inflationary period. There are so many variables at play here that between local and the marketplace, that seems to be a counterbalance to some of these things, that it's going to be really interesting to watch this play out. But no matter what, we should be do more than just bracing ourselves for increases. We should be planning for them, because clearly the continuum is more and more rights, more and more protection for employees. So the pendulum is shifting from employer to employee, whether that's wages, whether that's overtime, whether that's protections, whether that's discrimination. The pendulum continues to shift, and I don't see an end in sight for that. And so employers just need to be seeing around those corners and planning for it. Is there anything else you'd want to add, delete to close on this topic today, Mary?
I don't think so. I think that was a good summary, Mike. But you know, I think, the reminder that I want to tell employers is, even if this change wasn't happening, we should be looking at salaries every year for pay equity reasons, for compression reasons, right? You might have to hire people to get people in the door at higher salaries now, which I'm pretty sure every employer will agree on. A college grad that we were helping with career transition the other day made $91,000, as a college grad, right? Pretty sure the engineers internal aren't making that much more at that organization, right? So this is a big deal. We should be looking at pay equity within our organization every year, all the time. It should be part of our focus.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to transition. So what's kind of jumping through my head today, if you're a regular watcher of the show, Mary and I have conversations pretty frequently. And maybe today, Mary corrected me more than ever before. And it's a good thing, Mary. I'm thankful for it, because this is complex, and I kind of do this for a living, right? I've owned and been partners in many small businesses. We support 80,000 customers, mostly all small businesses. This stuff is hard. It's really complex, and most small businesses can't afford a $70,000, a $90,000, $110,000 SHRM certified HR professional on staff. And so that is where Assure comes in. It's where Mary's team comes in. So 3 different ways that we work with customers, very flexible to meet your model, whether it's just HR support for managers to make sure you're compliant, get the playbook, the employee handbook. So I'd say a playbook for HR on a very simple basis, or all the way up to total HR for all employees, where we literally become your outsourced fractional HR department. Your employees are coming to us, to Mary's staff, asking their questions. Hey, my boss did this, my manager did that, so-and-so in the break room just said this, what can I do? That we're the ones handling all that HR stuff for you, as well as being on offense, helping to be proactive, to keep you compliant, to protect you, in create a winning culture that you can attract and retain talent. So all of these options at an absolute fraction, truly pennies in the dollar, for whatever cost to bring someone in-house. So if you're interested, survey pops up at the end of this webinar. Just let us know. We'd happy to put you in contact with someone from Mary's team, see if this is a fit for your organization. And with that, if there's anything else we can do, this is what we do. We help small businesses grow by focusing on their core, by saving money, and staying compliant so that they can build winning teams. Mary, thanks for joining me again today.
Thanks, Mike. My pleasure.
Always enjoy it. Thanks.
Thank
thanks,
you.
everyone. Have a good day, everyone.